welcome. Thank you for coming to the Branford Forum. I'm Dan Raven. It's such a beautiful day, and everybody has so much stuff to do, so thank you so much for coming out. I think we have a great program for you today. We have, for those of you who are not on our email list, the e-blast list, please sign up for it. And if you have topics for the future, you'd like to hear about something special, please write it down there, and we'll try to accommodate your wishes. Special thanks to Joe Naylor for doing the filming on this event. The video from the last time is on the Branford Community TV website, and I'll send an email around with a link to that from Naftali Kaminsky. So it came out really nicely, and we hope to have this presentation up on the website as well in the near future. So before we get to the meat of the program, upcoming events on December 1st, Olivia Dreyer is going to talk about healing and reconciliation in Rwanda. Our first program in January is on January 15th, and it's co-sponsored with the library. James Boyce will talk about climate solutions. This coming Monday, there is a Turtle Bay conversation with Anne Gebeline, and Lloyd, her topic is?
Cyclic violence and immigration, and has to do with Honduras, El Salvador, and some of the policies that this country has put in place that inadvertently contributed to the Mexican-American immigration issue.
Right, thank you. She's a Latin American specialist. November 5th, may I remind you, is voting day. If anybody needs transportation to the polling site, write your name down on the clipboard, or see me afterwards, and we'll try to get something arranged. And finally, November 9th, in this space is a Tilde Cafe presentation on quantum entanglement in black holes. So if you want to sound really smart at your next cocktail party, this is the place. So today it's a fantastic pleasure to welcome Professor Robert Post. He's Sterling Professor of Law at the Yale Law School, and his topic is Understanding Citizens United, the Constitutional Question of Campaign Finance Reform. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out on this gorgeous day. I know it's a hard one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about campaign finance law and the constitutional aspects of campaign finance law. And it's an extremely complicated topic that many people think is really quite simple. So I'm just going to start off by a question or two just to give you a sense of the complexity of the thing. So suppose that there was a law which prohibited the sale for money of Hillary Clinton biographies. Do you have a sense of whether that was constitutional or not? I mean, would that raise a First Amendment question in your mind? A First Amendment question? You all think so. Anyone think that that's a simple case? All right. Suppose now I pose the question a little differently. Suppose I have a law which says you can't have advertisements for Hillary Clinton biographies. You can't advertise. You published a biography, but you can't advertise for it. Anyone think that's going to pose a problem?
Yeah.
Anyone think that's a simple case?
Yeah.
No? Yes?
Seems simple.
You think it's simple? Why?
Well, I guess we're used to freedom of expression in terms of both news content and advertising.
Yeah, so it's a simple one. You can't stop someone from advertising. Right, of course. All right, so notice what you've just said. I mean, normally when one talks to non-lawyers about campaign finance, the first thing they say is, well, it's simple because money isn't speech. And I've just given you two examples where all your instincts, every one of you, the instinct was money was speech. Because all I regulated in those examples I gave you was the money. Can't sell it for money, can't advertise, right? So many times the regulation of speech and the regulation of money for speech, same thing. And also, another suspicious thing about the examples I gave you was the motivation. Why would you just single out Hillary Clinton? But why is that motivation bad? Because it sounds like what the state is doing is going in and distorting the marketplace of ideas. That's a bad thing. That's a bad thing constitutionally, right? So whenever we think about campaign finance, it's not a simple question. It's not the simple question that money isn't speech, because as you've just shown with your responses to these two very simple hypotheticals, oftentimes money is speech. And so when we speak about the regulation of campaign finance, we are speaking about very difficult questions about the intersection of freedom of speech and the regulation of campaign finance. There's a very hard set of issues. Now, many people are tempted to think of this as a conservative liberal issue, just the conservatives on the court are for the First Amendment and the liberals are, and again, that is not the way it has been historically. Any of you recall William O. Douglas, remember him, a famous liberal? Yes. Or William J. Brennan, remember him? I mean, classic liberals, and they all believed that this was a tough problem under the First Amendment. So if we think about this and put aside the politics for the moment, because the politics are extremely partisan and extremely polarized, and that's a bad thing, I'm going to ask you to step back and think about this from first principles. It's not liberal conservative, it's how do we think about this problem of campaign finance. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about. I'm going to use as a sort of ground case Citizens United, because next to Roe versus Wade, that tends to be a Supreme Court case that everybody knows about. And in Citizens United, the court considered the constitutionality of a section of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, showing my age, which prohibited corporations from spending and having independent expenditures in support of a candidate during an election. And the court said, no, you can't do that. Why not? Because you can't distinguish between speakers. So the paradigmatic case of distinguishing between speakers is a simple one, right? I can't pass a law that says Hillary Clinton can talk and Trump cannot. I have to treat everybody more or less the same. The court said that's a basic rule. You can't engage in what we'll call viewpoint discrimination, which includes discrimination on the basis of who you are. And so that's what the law does, hence it's out under the First Amendment. That was the kind of reasoning which the court, under the authorship of Anthony Kennedy, said. And the court plainly believed that this was an obviously unconstitutional statute. The court said, and I'm quoting it now, "Under our law and our tradition, it seems stranger than fiction for government to make political speech a crime. And yet this is the statute's purpose and design." Now, Citizens United was 5-4, and the dissent was written by John Paul Stevens, and Stevens thought it was a pretty simple case the other way. Stevens said, "The court's ruling threatens to undermine the integrity of elected institutions across the nation." So here you have this conflict, the integrity of elected institutions and freedom of speech. And that's the conflict that is at the heart of Citizens United. And to understand that conflict, one has to understand the value which underlies both the majority opinion and the dissent. That's the value of self-government. In the United States, and constitutionally speaking, we take very seriously the fact that we govern ourselves. We determine our own fate. We're a democracy or a republic, however one wants to put it. And Citizens United, on both the majority and the dissent, is about self-government and what it means in America. Now, the problem with Citizens United is that there are actually two distinct ways of understanding self-government in the United States. One of them, let's call it Republican representation, and we realize Republican representation when we elect representatives, members of Congress or the state Senate, who then act in our name. And the other form of self-government is not through representation. It's through discursive democracy or democratic deliberation. And in democratic deliberation, the value of self-determination is realized when we get together and we talk to each other and we form public opinion, and the state is responsive to public opinion. So here we have two different ways of understanding what it means to govern ourselves. And a republic and a democracy each embody self-determination, but they do so in different ways. And Republican principles can sometimes reinforce democratic principles and sometimes contradict democratic principles. And we see that in Citizens United. So the court majority opinion, Anthony Kennedy in Citizens United, builds on democratic principles, but the dissent builds on principles of representation. So the court says, quote, "Speech is an essential mechanism of democracy, for it is the means to hold officials accountable to the people. The right of citizens to inquire, to hear, to speak, and to use information to reach consensus is a precondition to enlighten self-government and a necessary means to protect it," right? It's classic First Amendment. We protect speech so that we can have this deliberative democracy, discursive democracy. And the court infers from those principles, quote, "Laws that burden political speech are subject to strict scrutiny, which requires the government to prove that the restriction furthers a compelling interest and is narrowly tailored to serve that interest." So that's the majority opinion. But the dissent in Citizens United also insists on the principle of self-government. And whereas the court imagines self-government happening through speech, the dissent imagines self-government happening through representation. It imagines that self-government happens when people select representatives who engage in the actual practice of lawmaking. And it is of crucial importance for the dissent, therefore, and I'm quoting now, to assure that elections are indeed free and representative, because in a functioning democracy, the public must have faith that its representatives owe their positions to the people and not to the corporations with the deepest pockets. And the dissent associates this faith with compelling governmental interest in preserving the integrity of the electoral process. Right? So the crux of the constitutional issue for the dissent is the relationship between the people, that's us, and our representatives who are meeting in Hartford or in Washington, D.C. And the crux of the constitutional issue for the court is the capacity of the people freely to participate in the public discussions, not in elections, but in public discussions which inform their representatives in Hartford or in Washington, D.C. So the dissent and the court each agree that the fundamental constitutional value at stake is self-government, but they disagree on how that should be constitutionally constructed. So that's the tension that we have to deal with when we try to understand a case like Citizens United. And it's very hard theoretically to go right into this question. And the way to understand the two different paths of self-government in the United States, democracy on the one hand and representation on the other, the best way to get into that is to look at history and see, what does American history tell us about these two different forms of self-government. So that's what I'm going to do. We're going to start with the revolution. Why not? It starts with revolution. And do you remember the phrase that started the revolution? No taxation without representation, right? So the whole point of self-governance in the revolution was through representation. In the British Isles at that time was governed in Parliament, which is a system of representation. And we said, we deserve representation too. And the British said, what are you talking about? Every member of Parliament represents every member of the British Empire. And in point of fact, most people in England couldn't vote at the time because they had rotten boroughs. Just, the city of Manchester at the time of the American Revolution had no representative in Parliament. But this idea of virtual representation, that if you were elected by anyone, you represented everyone, that was the British notion of representation. And that's what they said to us, you colonists, you over there in the Americas. We virtually represent you, just like we virtually represent the people in Manchester or Liverpool or any of the other many, many British cities that had no representation in Parliament. And we said, no, that's not real representation. And we began to forge a theory of what it means to represent us. And one of the things is that we have to choose you. You can't represent us unless we elect you. If we're not your constituents, you're not our representative. That's what the colonists said in constructing the case against Great Britain. And second, they said there have to be an identity of interest between the representatives and the people they represent. They have to believe that there is something in common. So the people in England are in common with America because they can tax us and they don't have to be able to tax. So there's a disparity of interests. Whereas a representative who represents us in Hartford has to pay the same tax that the rest of us pay if they pass it. So they are truly representative. And this theory emerges out of the American Revolution and the theory of the American Revolution. And so we had the idea of self-government. It was essential to us, but it always was mediated by this concept of representation. So along comes 1789. And we have to make a constitution. And the crux of the matter of the Constitution, according to Madison, was this problem of representation. How do we construct representation of this new federal government such that it will embody the principle, what Madison called the democratic principle of government? So we found our country, says Madison, on the theory of self-government. It is essential, he says, to every plan of free government which would be more stable and durable if it should rest on the solid foundation of the people themselves. So we have to do that. And yet the people who founded the federal government also feared what they called the fury of democracy, which we're experiencing at the moment. They were apprehensive, quote, of the amazing violence and turbulence of the democratic spirit, which can seize, quote, the popular passions and spread like wildfire and become irresistible. And they believed, and I'm quoting now, the democratic communities may be unsteady and be led to action by the impulse of the moment. These are all comments in the Constitutional Convention. And so therefore, they sought very self-consciously to distinguish a Republican form of government from a democratic form of government. And they thought a Republican form of government would avoid both despotism on the one hand and what they called the extremes of democracy on the other. And you get a sense of how seriously they took this difference between a republic and a democracy. John Marshall, who was the first Chief Justice of the United States, very famous man, wrote a biography of George Washington, and he praised Washington for being, I'm quoting now Marshall, a real Republican. But between a balanced republic and a democracy, the difference is like that between order and chaos. And you probably don't remember that when James Madison wrote the very famous Federalist Papers, one of the selling points of the Constitution that he wrote in the Federalist Papers was that the new Constitution, I'm quoting Madison now, involved, quote, the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity from any share in the government. The people in the United States had no share in the governance in the federal government. It was all done through representatives. So how do we know that those representatives are our representatives? So the first and most important thing to the founders was elections. They said that frequency of elections is the great bulwark of our liberty. That's what they said in the Constitutional Convention. We keep choosing the people. They have to be responsive to their constituents, otherwise they won't be chosen. Just look at what's happening with the impeachment now and the threat of being primary. And they thought, the founders thought, that elections constituted the essence of a free and responsible government. And they debated many aspects of this representation. Who should vote? What should be the qualifications for vote? How large should the districts be? Such that the people believed that their representatives were their representatives. That's the key point. That we own, or that we believe that our representatives speak for us. Madison put it this way, that we have to establish that communion of interests and sympathy of sentiments without which every government degenerates into tyranny. So it's tyrannical unless there's a communion between us and our representatives. We believe they speak for us, because if they don't speak for us, we're just being governed by them, and that's not self-government, right? So any representative government, to be democratic, has to have this identity between us, the voters, and our representatives up there. So in the founding era, this was largely underwritten by a culture of deference. This was the 18th century. And in the 18th century, people who were educated, who were wealthy, who were professional, you deferred to them because they knew better than you if you were a blacksmith or if you were a painter or if you were a farmer. And so there was this, your representative spoke for you because you were used to deferring to the people who were elites. And there wasn't this problem of, do the elites speak for me? Because typically I deferred. But this culture of deference, which pervaded the United States until the 1820s, collapsed during what we call the Jacksonian period. This was when, after Andrew Jackson becomes president of the United States, 1828. And suddenly America becomes, in the word you might remember, Alexis de Tocqueville, democracy in America, becomes extremely democratic and extremely egalitarian, such that there was no deference at all. There was hostility to elites. You might think of Jackson as the first populist president. And during this era, this is when you have universal white suffrage, white male suffrage. Before that, there were property qualifications. You had to be a person of substance before you could vote. During the 1820s, these are eliminated in all the states. So if you're white and male and above a certain age, you can vote whether or not you own property. And as de Tocqueville says, touring the country at that time, he says, the superior classes of society are carefully excluded from by the people from the exercise of authority. So if you were rich, that was a disadvantage in the electorate at the time. Everybody's born in a log cabin house. This is the time when you see the log cabin as the symbol of the American politician. Everybody is a person of the people. Everybody is a common person, or they pretend to be. And this is, you never present yourself as like living in Trump Tower and the rest of you can whatever. And so the majority becomes irresistible. This is the point when the majority starts ruling in America as the majority. In the time of the founders, it wasn't the majority, it was the elites who were in Congress, who was the president or the Senate, who were supposed to tell the rest of us who were supposed to defer to them what was better and not. And this meant that during the Jacksonian people, I'm quoting now, the people become the real directing power, and although the form of government is representative, it is evident that the opinions, the prejudices, the interests, and even the passions of the community are hindered by no durable obstacles from the exercise of a perpetual influence on our society. That's from the U.S. Magazine, first democratic magazine in the United States. And you might remember George Bancroft. He's an historian, great Jacksonian figure. He says on the 4th of July, 1826, he says, "The popular voice is all powerful with us. This is our oracle. This, we acknowledge, is the voice of God." That during the founding era, the voice of the people was not the voice of God. Madison may have been the voice of God, but the people were definitely not the voice of God. So this is what we mean when we say about the collapse of deference, that the people were governing in their name. But now we have a problem, which is, how do I know that the representatives speak for me? I mean, I want them to represent the people, but the people are all divided in what they think, and everybody comes from a log cabin. There's nobody to defer to. So how do you know that the representative that you've elected, it actually speaks for you? What's going to connect you to your representatives in Hartford or in Washington? In the Jacksonian period, this becomes a huge crisis. And we solve this crisis by doing something new in the Western world. We create the first mass political parties ever, anywhere. The Jacksonian Party, that was now the Democratic Party, the Whig Party. These are parties that reach out. Everyone can be a member. They have torchlight parades. They have clubs. And everyone, the turnout at this time is like 86, 85% of the elections. Everyone is involved through these mass parties, which in turn, and the mass parties solve the problem of representation. How is that? Because the parties are organized around political platforms, ideas, principles, and you select a party that corresponds to the principles you believe in, and the party selects the people who it believes will forward those principles. Mm-hmm. So I'm connected to my representatives through the vehicle of the party. The founders did not believe in factions. They thought factions and parties would be a terrible thing because every individual should exercise their own choice. We invent this idea of political parties to underwrite the whole concept of representation. I know that this person represents me because I'm a Democrat and they're a Democrat. I'm a Whig they're a Whig. And this whole configuration of politics emerges in the 1820s and the 1830s, and it saves representation in the United States through the creation of these parties. And these parties and this structure stayed in effect in the United States until the end of the 19th century. The Whig Party collapsed, it was replaced by the Republican Party, but still you had this mass mobilization, these mass parties, and individuals connected to the parties. If you were a wise person in 1900 and you were to give advice about how to get connected in politics, you would say to somebody, go join a party, become a party boss. And then you'll be able to determine what the principles are that you want. That's how you affect the future, through the vehicle of the parties. And then this continues until basically the Progressive Era, which is the beginning of the 20th century in the United States. And at that time, political parties collapsed. And the reason political parties collapsed during the Progressive Era is because they had, to run this machine of politics, they required a lot of money and a lot of support. And what they basically did is they took money from the corporations and or other wealthy people, they put it into the party, and then the party supported itself instead of standing for the principles which presumably they had addressed to the public. And people became disgusted with political parties because they viewed it as connected to bossism, political boss, like Tammany machine, which exists to support itself as a machine, but it was the Democratic Party in New York City. And because they associated with the corporations who could easily learn out how to buy these political parties, and so the parties sold out to the corporations. The law which is at stake in Citizens United was first enacted in 1912 to precisely out of this feeling that the political parties were under the control of the corporations and we have to keep them out of politics. And so if you think about the innovations of the Progressive Era, the initiative, the referendum, the recall, at the time, who ran for election? The parties nominated. People said no, so they created something called direct primaries, where the people chose who would be the nominees of the party. Senators at the time were elected by state legislatures, which means by the parties that control the legislatures. And we changed that. We amended the Constitution to have direct election. All of this is by way of bypassing the parties and the people directly governing themselves. The famous historian Richard Hofstadter, he put it this way. He said, the progressives wanted to bring about direct popular rule, to break up the political machines, and to circumvent representative government. And that's what they did. I mean, they totally changed the political landscape of the United States. But now we have our problem that we talked about before. How do I know, once they get rid of the parties, that those people who we elected stand for me? What connects me to those people? This problem doesn't go away, right? The parties had solved the problem. We get rid of the parties, and so how do we know that they're responsive to me? And the progressives came up with this very elegant solution. They redefined democracy. They start using the word democracy because they're saying it's directly between me and the government. I'm not mediated by representatives anymore. So not republic, democracy. Our self-understanding of ourselves as a democracy comes out of the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So how do the progressives connect us to the government? They redefine government. They say a democracy is, quoting now, government by public opinion. This was a new definition of what democracy was, and the underlying thought here was each of us can contribute to public opinion by talking to each other. This is the age of mass communications. We have now not only penny press, we have the yellow press. Everyone is reading the newspapers in the morning, and there's a wonderful image I came across where George Cooley, who's a famous psychologist, says, you're sitting at the breakfast table and the father is reading, he says, the newspaper instead of talking to his kids and his wife, just like a screen. It's like an iPhone, like you're putting the text of the public discussion in front of your face, even when you're at home in the company of your family. Everyone is living together through this. It's as if Herbert Crowley, a famous progressive, said, it's as if we're carrying on a national conversation through these media. We have the telegraph, we have immediate communications, we have railroads, which gets news out. And suddenly everyone came through this vehicle of public opinion, help talk to your friends, talk to the newspaper editors, affect them. And if I'm affecting public opinion and the government is responsive to public opinion, then the government is responsive to me. That's the general thought that comes out of the progressive era. But the idea of democracy in the progressive era is really, it comes out in two ways, and we have to be very careful in characterizing it. One way, call that direct democracy. And in direct democracy, the people themselves decide. It's like a referendum or an initiative. If we want to know what public opinion is, we take a vote or take a public opinion poll. That's a snapshot of public opinion, and we govern ourselves by saying, what do the people really want? So that's direct democracy. And and if you think about that for a second, you'll see that, well, you can do that sometimes, but you can't do that all the time. And still, most of government is going to have to be carried on through the vehicle of representatives who are going to be meeting on a daily basis and doing the daily work of government. But direct democracy is one thing. But then another idea emerges, which is going to be influential for us and for you, and let's call that discursive democracy. So this idea is not that we decide something or that we become as a public visible in a public opinion poll. It's rather that there is this thing out there called public opinion, and as the observer of the American scene, James Bryce, in American Government, said, American politicians are more attentive to this public opinion than to anything else, but no one knows what it is exactly. So everyone's trying to figure out what is public opinion, which, in Bryce's words, rules in the United States as a pervading and impalpable power, like the ether, which passes through all things. It binds all the parts of the complicated system together and gives them whatever unity of aim and action they possess. So within this concept of discursive democracy, in opposition to direct democracy, completely different than it, public opinion from this perspective is something that's always changing. It's always in flux. It's like Heraclitus' river when he says you can never step in the same river twice because it's always moving by you. It's always active, always never repeated. It's unremitting. It's ubiquitous, and it surrounds and envelops the government, and it holds it continuously but indirectly accountable. It's the muffled voice, in the famous words of Bryce, that politicians are always struggling to hear. You know, what is it actually? What is the really public opinion? You can't really know, but you're trying to know what public opinion means. Therefore, public opinion can be known only indirectly. And its effect on government is mediated because there's always contested views about what is the public really thinking. Are we really for impeachment? Are we really against? Who knows? But we have these contests of thinking about what public opinion should mean. And so when we think about the integrity of this discursive democracy and public opinion formation, it's not in its outcome, like an election. It's rather in the processes by which it's formed. Everybody has a chance to participate in this thing, this nebulous ether, public opinion. And it's important that you do participate in it because the state is going to be responsive, as distinct from, we know it tells us to do one thing or another. And because we all have to participate in it, this public opinion has a really amazing property, which is it connects you to your government. It makes you feel active. It gives you ownership. James Bryce, when he came to the United States, he was from England, he said, the interesting thing about the Americans is that they're talking constantly and they feel like they own the government rather than the subjects and the government owns them. And why is that? Because they can participate in this formation of public opinion. I once taught a course on democracy with a British philosopher named Bernard Williams, very really preeminent guy at Oxford, and he says, you call yourself like a citizen. I call myself a subject. Big difference. And this is in the United States. This comes from being able to participate and own and shape public opinion. When de Tocqueville in the 1830s wrote about public opinion, he viewed it as oppressive. I'm oppressed by public opinion. It's like being in a small town, where everyone's gossiping about you and you can't move. That was his idea of public opinion. But by the end of the century, public opinion was liberated because I can help make it in my image, whatever I want it to be. Now, this had fantastically important constitutional implications. It may surprise you to know, you know the First Amendment, it was ratified in 1791. There are no cases protecting freedom of speech as a judicially cognizable right until the 1930s. Until the 1930s. The First Amendment, the first time ever a Supreme Court justice says that there's such a thing as freedom of speech that should be protected, he does it in dissent, is November of 1919. Right? First time ever. And what happens is that the progressives come to believe very much in this government by public opinion, because the parties have collapsed, the weaknesses of American parties, leads to the idea that we all should be able to participate in this formation of public opinion. And if we all should, then maybe the courts ought to protect it. But what really happens is in World War I, Woodrow Wilson, you might remember, completely censored the formation of public opinion. He had a committee on propaganda led by a guy named George Creel, Committee on Public Information, and it put you in jail if you criticized World War I. And it fed false information about what was happening in Europe to everyone in the country. And this was appalling to people who had come to believe that they have a right to direct the state through their participation in the formation of public opinion. And so that's what leads Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis on the Supreme Court for the first time in 1919 and 1920 to say, well, this ought to be actually a constitutional right. You ought to enforce this thing, this First Amendment, this freedom of speech. And that's what leads to the kind of freedom of speech that you all take for granted. Why do we protect this freedom of speech? So that you can have democratic legitimation, so that you can imagine that the state is responsive to you, so that you can participate in this value that we've been talking about, self-governance. And so when the Supreme Court finally comes to protect First Amendment rights for the first time ever in the history of the country, first time in the history of the country in 1930s, the Supreme Court says in 1931, in a very famous and path-breaking case called Stromberg versus California, quote, "The maintenance of the opportunity for free political discussion to the end that government may be responsive to the will of the people and that changes may be obtained by lawful means, an opportunity essential to the security of the republic, is a fundamental principle of our constitutional system." So why do we protect freedom of speech? Because of this value of self-government. To have the value of democratic legitimation. And for the past 80 years, First Amendment jurisprudence has been founded on the premise, quote, that speech concerning public affairs is the essence of self-government. I'm quoting from the court. And it has repeatedly emphasized that the First Amendment exemplifies, quote, a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. The First Amendment serves to ensure that the individual citizen can effectively participate in and contribute to our Republican system of self-government, end quote. And remember, I quoted you from the majority opinion in Citizens United, exactly this rhetoric. So what does this all have to do with Citizens United? So you get the sense of self-government through speech, like I've just been developing for you, self-government through representation, Justice Stevens, and they're colliding in Citizens United. And the question is, how do you put one with the other? That's the crux of the problem in Citizens United. And the interesting thing is, in the history of campaign finance reform in the United States, it has always been justified in terms of the logic of Republican representation. And that logic turns out to be, in very key respects, incompatible with the logic of discursive democracy. This is the real tragedy of the case that comes out with Citizens United. So the three justifications which were put on the table for campaign finance control in Citizens United, the first was equality. You know, some people are more equal than others. We can't have that. Now, if you think about Republican representation, equality is, of course, an essential value. We all say one person, one vote. Why is that? Because Republican representation is about reaching a decision. You have an election, and everyone should have an equal influence on the decision. So this principle of equality makes perfect sense within the logic of Republican representation. But in discursive democracy, remember what I told you? We don't reach decisions. The minute you reach a decision, you're out of the world of discursive democracy, which is a continuous process, never reaches visibility, never reaches an end. If you take an opinion poll on one day, could be people change their mind tomorrow, could be you have new people coming in, could be how you ask the question, a million different things. You don't reach a decision. So what are you going to be equal with respect to? You can't be equal with respect to the ability to influence that decision. I mean, I may be really inarticulate and you may be really eloquent. That can't be, we can't have equality on that. You may care about the issue a whole lot and I may not care at all. There's not an equality at all with respect to anything. More importantly, the logic of discursive democracy is you get to speak in a way that is adequate to your convictions, what you care about. That's not a logic of equality. The logic within discursive democracy is about a meaningful participation in public discourse, not an equal participation. And in fact, your participation could be so unequal, we could imagine that it's no longer meaningful. We can conceive that, but what makes that a problem is that it's not meaningful, not that it's not equal. Or conversely, I can make you all have an equal participation. You know, you all get 15 minutes on the public access channel, and that's all you can say in public. And suddenly, participation no longer becomes an avenue for democratic legitimation. So equality is not the essence of the matter. The essence of the matter is you get to speak in a way that's meaningful to you. And so equality, and so the court once said, you know, you can't shut one person up because their voice isn't equal to somebody else under the First Amendment. It seems to me right. If you're going to consider this under the logic of deliberative democracy, that is not an appropriate justification. Second justification that gives is something we call the anti-distortion principle. And here, the logic is perfectly clear when we think of representation, Republican representation. We want whatever system we have of measuring your votes to represent the real will of the people. We want it to be an accurate register of what people are really feeling. We don't want distortions. So you don't get to vote twice, or this person who's from outside the county doesn't get to vote in the county elections or whatever, because we want the elections accurately reflect what people actually want when we have the election. So the notion of an anti-distortion principle is absolutely clear-cut, makes a lot of sense in the context of Republican representation. But what about in the context of discursive democracy? The idea of distortion presupposes we know what the thing is, and this distorts it. But remember my discussion of what public opinion is under discursive democracy. We don't know what it is. Everyone's trying to figure out what it is. There's no baseline of real public opinion from which this is a distortion. And so the whole logic of anti-distortion runs into a problem immediately as you translate it into discursive democracy. So for example, can I shut you up because you're going to distort public opinion? I mean, that doesn't even make sense. So because public opinion is whatever it is after you've had the chance to talk. So public opinion is what it is so long as everybody is speaking according to their First Amendment rights. That's the meaning of it. It doesn't mean I can't say you can't have a blockbuster movie because it's going to distort public opinion. People are going to think too much about Downton Abbey, so you can't show it. No, that's not a rationale under the First Amendment. So the anti-distortion principle, which makes perfect sense and which was argued to the court, does not make sense in the context of discursive democracy. And the last and the most important interest which was given before the court was anti-corruption. So what do we mean by corruption? Corruption is a concept that derives from Republican representation. And corruption is a matter of the role definition of a representative. It tells us how should a representative act. They should act for the public interest, and they shouldn't act to line their own private pockets. So corruption is telling us when an elected representative is violating the rules of the game. And the classic, you might know these Latin words, the classic example of corruption is a quid pro quo, right? I give you money and you vote for the franchise to go to this. That's a no-no, because the representative is not voting for the franchise because they think it's the right thing. They're voting for it because they want to get the money in their pocket. That's a violation. That's corruption. And so it's a concept that comes out of representation, and it's a fundamental concept in any representative democracy, anti-corruption. And because everyone understood that quid pro quos are bad, the first case that came before the Supreme Court dealing with campaign finance split the baby. And it said you can put a limit on contributions, but you can't put a limit on independent expenditures. It's a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. So why is that? If you have a contribution, it looks like a little like a quid pro quo, because you're giving it right to the representative, so we can put a limit on that to prevent. But if you're just spending money for you wanting to talk, that looks a lot like free speech. And so there's no constitutional limitations on that. So this distinction, this compromise between discursive democracy and Republican representation was right, has been with us since 1976 in Buckley versus Vallejo. You can constitutionally limit contributions. You cannot limit independent expenditures. Now that was the compromise. It turns out to be a very bad compromise because very rich people are spending a lot. And it makes us feel like they own, even though they're independent, like they own the representatives. And on the other hand, a lot of people feel like they want to express their connection to a representative, and so they wanted to give more. And this has created terrible dynamics. Among other things, it's said to representatives, you need money, but you can't get it from contributions. In small it has to be in small packages, so they spend endless times raising more money. So it's put representatives on a kind of hamster wheel of always trying to raise money, and they can never get enough. It has had a lot of terrible, terrible side effects. And intellectually, it's crude. And it doesn't really account for a lot of the pathologies that are going on. But it's what we have. But the core point about it is that no one really understands what corruption is apart from the paradigm case of quid pro quo. And that's because in a democracy, we want our representatives to be responsive to their constituents. That's part of the meaning of democracy. So, just think of a simple paradigm case. A politician is loyal and does the bidding of the political party that puts him in the office. Is that a quid pro quo? Mm-hmm. Or, Trump and the evangelicals. Trump does a lot of what the evangelicals want because they're voting for him. Is that a quid pro quo? So we don't really know what a quid pro quo is apart from the paradigmatic case of here's $1, no man, I want to get a vote. And so we don't know how to generalize this notion of corruption in any meaningful way. And so when the court has been consistently pushing it back into this, actually you can't give money in order to corrupt the official in return for a favor. But apart from that, it turns out to be an extremely hard concept to generalize and to get much constitutional weight out of, because if you're just looking at the bribery scenario, it's not going to get you very far in campaign finance. So that's the problem of campaign finance. That is, it has been attempted to be justified in the Supreme Court through concepts that make perfect sense in the context of Republican representation, but that make no sense in the context of discursive democracy. So our problem is, what do we do about that? How do we resolve the tension? And I'm going to put on the table a solution, then I'll shut up and we can talk about whatever you want. This is how I think the court should have resolved it, but it didn't. It should have thought harder about why we have First Amendment rights in the first place, about what discursive democracy is, because it's using these First Amendment rights to trump campaign finance. So in Citizens United, Kennedy just says, look, there's a First Amendment rule, can't discriminate between speakers. This discriminates between corporations and everyone else. Out. End of story. Because there is no sufficient justification to make this distinction, says Kennedy. And then he looks at the three justifications I just gave you. He looks at anti-distortion. He looks at equality. He looks at corruption. He says none of that is a reason that corporations shouldn't be able to spend money on their own. And so this law has to be thrown out as unconstitutional. So let's back up. It always helps in law. When you get a rule, say, well, why do you have that rule? So why do you have this rule that you can't discriminate between speakers when they're speaking about public? Why do we do that? And the answer might be because everyone has an equal right to affect public opinion. Right? I can't discriminate between you and you because each of you has the right to make public opinion responsive to you. But that's why you're speaking, to make public opinion responsive to you. If that were not true, if you didn't imagine that public opinion was responsive to you, you'd have no reason to talk at all. You'd be spitting into the wind, right? So there has to be this underlying notion that government is responsive to you, or is responsive to public opinion, to get the whole mechanism of First Amendment rights off the ground, even if you're in the world of discursive democracy. So why do we think that the government is responsive to public opinion? Elections, right? We think that elections will make them responsive. But maybe the elections are structured so that we no longer believe the elections are doing that. Maybe the elections are structured such that we think that they're only responsive, our representatives are only responsible to people who give them a lot of money, or to corporations, right? I haven't given you the justification of equality. I haven't given you the justification of distortion, and I haven't given you the justification of corruption. What I've given you is the premise of having First Amendment rights at all is that the government is responsive to public opinion, and typically via the avenue of elections, but elections aren't having that effect on me anymore. I no longer believe that the officials are responsive to the public opinion, which is supposed to connect me to them. If that's true, if that fails, then we have a failure that's really deep, right? And that depth undermines having a First Amendment right at all, because the only reason I talk is to make the government responsive to me. Let's call that electoral integrity. That is a fundamental, compelling government interest. And if that interest is failing, then First Amendment rights fail. So there's no tension between electoral representation and First Amendment rights. First Amendment rights require us to believe that our elections are such that they make our representatives responsive to public opinion. And if that fails, then so do our First Amendment rights. That's a pretty compelling government interest that could get campaign finance off the ground. Now, it's a complicated interest because it doesn't mean that elected officials have to follow public opinion polls. That would be wrong because a public opinion poll is not public opinion. Public opinion poll is a result of a public opinion. That's direct democracy, right? We don't know what public opinion actually is all we can get is a snapshot at a given time that is affected and distorted by the questions that you ask and who asked it and of whom was it asked, etc. Public opinion is something that is always diffuse and vague and subject to interpretation. But if all of us believe that whatever it is, the officials are not looking there, that's a problem, right? So I'm not saying that they should be subject to public opinion polls or that we could have this mechanism which would always make them subject to a direct initiative or referendum or something like that. I'm not saying that at all. And so this puts a very complicated construct on how representatives are supposed to respond to public opinion. There's a wonderful political theorist named Hannah Pitkin who put this notion of what are our representatives supposed to do. She said this: none of the analogies of acting for others on the individual level seems satisfactory for explaining the relationship between political representatives and his constituents. He is neither agent, nor trustee, nor deputy, nor commissioner. So electoral integrity is not a concept that can be applied to the particular decisions of particular representatives. It's instead a property of a system of representation. We say, in general, these elections are not working that way. They don't merit our trust that we're electing people who are responsive to public opinions. And as Pitkin says, the representing done by an individual legislator must be seen as embodied in a whole political system. What makes it representation is not any single action by any one participant, but the overall structuring and functioning of the system. And yet, this vague concept is at the foundation of any notion of self-government that we have. And our Supreme Court has said to us that it has never, well, I'll put it this way, our Supreme Court has never even crossed the mind of our Supreme Court that this concept of electoral integrity is really what's at the heart of campaign finance. And so they've never thought about it. They've never given it consideration in saying whether or not we ought to uphold this regulation of corporate contributions or independent expenditures or anything like it. Now, there is a lot more to be said on this subject, but I've talked for too long, so I'm going to just summarize, and then we'll take questions. One, what we really have in Citizens United is a tension between two forms of self-government, and we have the court saying this notion of discursive democracy, which we exercise, all of us, in our First Amendment rights, trumps elections. And we've set up this tension, and the way in which it's been conceived and argued to the court has all been within the logic of representative representation. And the court has resisted it, I think, kind of rightly, but the court hasn't taken the time to think about how this comes out when you think seriously, as the court is not thinking seriously, because it never asked this question, why we have these First Amendment rights in the first place. And if you ask that question, you can get a key that can unlock much of what's going on in these cases. So I'll stop there, and you've had your hand up now for an hour.
My understanding of the idea of a corporation is that it is represented legally as, quote, an individual. And
it's a person for the law. It has legal personality, you say.
Okay. And my understanding is very limited, but that's what it is. How did a corporation become this idea of an individual before the law? I have a horrendous problem with the directors of these corporations who, under any other circumstance, would have ended up in jail. And yet you cannot jail a corporation. And I think if things were a little more direct in terms of the malfeasance and the individuals that are doing the perp walk, we'd have a lot less of it. But I'm interested in how this idea of a corporation and this individual evolved.
So it goes back to the Middle Ages. There's a wonderful book by a guy named Kantorowicz called The King's Two Bodies. So you think about the king in England, embodies the sovereignty of the country, embodies the corporate identity of England. The individual king dies, the body of the king dies, but the kingship doesn't die. That's the king's two bodies. So he has a body which is mortal, which can fall sick, which can become insane, but the kingship, which is a part of the body, stays on. So there's this notion that there's a corporate entity which continues regardless of the individual who happens to occupy the office. That's the core idea. They get this also from the Pope, who represents the divinity of Christ on earth in the Middle Ages. And the office, the vicar, the office of the vicar continues even though the particular occupant of it can die. So this idea has very ancient roots. It gets the idea of a corporation. Corporations used to be a special privilege of immortality. That's what a corporate is. It's immoral. It's an entity that's a legal entity that is apart from the particular individuals who inhabit it. It's immortal, it can never die. This is an attribute of sovereignty. And this attribute of sovereignty was originally given by the monarchs for particular purposes. A famous one would be the East India Company, which is incorporated and conquers India, or the Virginia Company, which creates the colony of Virginia. These are all corporations which become in the U.S. states because they're incorporated. Incorporation, it's like the miracle of the wafer. You know, it has two, you can eat it, but it remains still the indivisible body of Christ. And so this notion of a special thing, and corporations in their original form in the 17th and 18th century had sovereign powers. They could exercise the power of eminent domain, for example, take your property for corporate purposes. And they were a special privilege given by the state. And when I talked about egalitarianism in the Jacksonian period, it was a major revolt against these incorporations as special privileges. And what they said was everyone gets to incorporate for whatever they want. And this is the world we live in now, where you just file a paper of incorporation and you have it. So we have this legal form that has proliferated. It's been an amazing engine of development and capitalism, but it rests on this legal fiction that you identify, that you can trace back to the monarchy of Great Britain. Yeah.
But corporations are still creatures of the state.
Of course they are.
Okay, and it seems to me that, first of all, the state gives you a corporation a great gift, okay? And that's the gift of limited liability, that your stockholders have limited liability.
Yes.
I don't understand why constitutionally Congress cannot limit the political speech powers of corporations in a corporate form. That's number one. Number two, I would suggest that now there's another reason for putting some constraints on corporate speech, and that's what came out of the 2016 election. That is to protect the integrity of our elections against interference by outside powers, other countries.
Well, that puts many things on the table. First, even it's an opinion by Brett Kavanaugh when he was on the DC Circuit. He upholds the limit on independent expenditures for non-citizens. We have that in our thing, and he said, no, that's not a problem. Right? So that's still in effect. Second, why can't Congress do it? I think of a state-created state incorporation laws which prohibited expenditures for political purposes. That would be perfectly constitutional because you wouldn't have given it the power to do it in the first place. Third point, what the court does in Citizens United is that it says, well, a corporation is a person legally, and therefore it's indistinguishable from you and me. I think that's a fundamental mistake, right? Because no corporation has a constitutional right to run for office. You can't have a corporation vote. I mean, there's just lots of things that corporations cannot do that distinguish them from you and me. And in particular, let's look at why we protect these First Amendment rights in the first place. Again, we come back to this theme. So we protect it so that you can imagine that the state is responsive to you. Commercial corporation is not like that. It's not a person that can experience democratic legitimacy. It's like if there was a robot text that was proliferating on the internet, it wouldn't have First Amendment rights. Why not? Because it can't experience this value of democratic legitimation. Now, there's a deep point here, which is we have the right to associate together, to express our rights together. Let's call that an expressive association. So you form like the such and such political group. I can't regulate the political group even though you have the right. The group would have the same rights that you do. So that's when we associate, in order to exercise our First Amendment rights, we form what in constitutional doctrine we call an expressive association. That association has the rights of its members. And it doesn't matter whether that associate incorporates or not, because it's that kind of an organization that exists to express the views of its members. There's a famous case, FEC versus Citizens for Life. It's a Brennan opinion holding exactly this. But Most corporations you're thinking about, like commercial, like Campbell's Soup or GM, are not formed as expressive associations. They're the opposite. They're commercial corporations. They exist to have a profit, not to express the views of their members. And so from that point of view, they have no First Amendment rights. They have no First Amendment rights of their members, let's put it that way. What the court has held in other cases, on the other hand, is that they can valuably contribute to the store of information that the rest of us have. And so First Amendment rights have a lot of different component parts. One is the right to speak, which is founded on this democratic legitimation. The other is the right to receive information, which is not founded on democratic legitimation, but founded on your right to be an informed citizen. And corporations, said the court in a famous case called Bellotti versus Massachusetts, can contribute to the store of information, and therefore it would be unconstitutional to regulate them in a way that interferes with the flow of information to auditors, to listeners like you. If you take that as good law, it would lead to an analysis of the rights of corporations to speak that would turn on whether they're providing really important information to them. And that's a whole different logic than Citizens United. And I think it would probably lead to a logic which would allow for their regulation, for reasons we can talk about in other questions, because I've answered this one for too long. Go ahead.
Why is money speech?
Why is what?
Why is money speech?
That's what we started in our first question. So I come back to that question. So do you think it would be constitutional to say that biographies of Hillary Clinton can't be sold?
So that's constitutional.
It's the same question, because all I've done is regulated the money.
No, but you're...
I said, you can write it, you can give it away. You just
Okay,
can't
so
sell
in
it.
the context of Citizens United, money was under consideration, as I understand it, as a form of bribery, as a form of eliciting a particular action of interest to the donor.
Correct.
And buying a book does not qualify if that's what...
Right, all right, so but first I want to get the money isn't speech out of the way, because often
Okay.
people come back to that. Second is, what you're describing is like a form of bribery. You mean the corruption interest.
Yeah.
Right, and so the difficulty with the corruption interest is no one can define what it is. So if I'm going to give you money and you're going to get a vote, yes, but this is not what's happening. This is people making, in that case, a movie about Hillary Clinton. They weren't getting anything back in return in particular. So it's not like that kind of quid pro quo. So what kind of corruption exactly is it? And when you really start to press your intuitions about that case, they depart a lot from corruption, and it looks more like the whole system is being corrupted. That's a different kind of claim, and I've tried to give you a theory of what that claim might look like, but it wouldn't turn on corruption. It would turn on the failure of the system to do what we wanted to do in the first place. Yeah.
Ed Meyer, Dean. After Citizens United, our Yale Law School class met with Justice Scalia. And let me just tell you briefly that conversation and get your reaction to it.
He told you get over it.
His message to us was about states' rights. He said there is no more important constitutional right in our country than states' rights, and that's why we're a republic and not a democracy. We came back to him, Citizens United had passed, he'd written a decision on it, and we said, your decision in Citizens United just threw out our campaign finance law in Connecticut. We recently, a few years ago, passed a law that permitted public financing campaigns and prohibition on corporate and political action committee contributions.
Right.
We said to him, we had a very strong public policy in this, because state public policy, because our governor's in jail for taking corporate contributions. Our state treasurer, Sylvester, was in jail because of taking contributions. Justice Scalia then turned to the First Amendment. And we argued, we were all lawyers, we argued that the First Amendment is not unfettered. That Justice Holmes had said in the 1930s, you can't cry fire in a crowded theater. And here we are, where the First Amendment should be preempted by a very significant public policy in the state of Connecticut. You didn't answer that.
Of course he didn't answer, because he has no answer. I mean, I've just given you a First Amendment argument, you know, and that argument is fundamental to the First Amendment, because it's why we have these rights at all. I could give you 5 others that turn, for example, on this idea of what a commercial corporation is, which Scalia knows, right? If corporations had First Amendment right, all of corporate law would be out the window, because it tells you how to form, what your voting has to be, et cetera. And of course, none of that is subject to First Amendment review. So there's a lot to be said. He tends to favor federalism, except when he doesn't, which turns out other things. Then, you know, it turns, he believed passionately in this First Amendment, but I think he believed that it was Democrats trying to censor Republicans. That's what I mean, if you read his opinions, it becomes screamingly obvious that he thinks this is a way of Democrats to cut off the funding, which are corporations of the right and of conservative and the Republican Party like him. That's actually what he believed. He did not believe that electoral integrity, in the sense I've described it, is at stake. And so it becomes a complicated question how you show that electoral integrity is actually at stake. I argue, this is all like, if you're interested in pursuing it more, this is all in a book called Citizens Divided. And I argue in the book that this should be what we call political question. Because it's about, it really requires political judgment about the integrity of our system. And Scalia should have known that. But we are in such a partisan world, of which Scalia is an example, that he really perceives the political system differently than we do. And so what you need is these abstract legal rules that will force him to defer in the right ways, because what he does is, of course, he strikes down, in the name of a national First Amendment, campaign finance laws in many states. Yeah.
Are there any cases in the federal court pipeline that might get to the Supreme Court and give them an opportunity to readdress the issues, or is it going to be left to Congress?
It's not going to be left to Congress, because the court has taken it away by making this unconstitutional, first. And second, I'm afraid that the Supreme Court, in my professional lifetime, is going to go further rather than less far in this. They'll probably strike down limits and contributions next. This court has been, if we go back to political question, it's the Roberts Court that said political gerrymandering is a political question. So they know how to make that judgment if they want to make it. But I think in this case, this is a court that is First Amendment crazy. They're using the First Amendment to strike down all forms of commercial regulations, et cetera, et cetera. And, I have to stand up, I have to teach constitutional law with this court. It's not the easiest thing in the world.
On a different note, the representation, how do you explain superdelegates? And in terms of representation, and also I had a question about free speech as it applies to, I think there's a recent, I heard recently that, I don't know if it was, I think it was Facebook or someone, some big giant company is promoting, is allowing more
political ads that are not fact-checked, is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, and there's someone actually running for governor in California to prove that that he will have more access to speech than he would if he didn't.
Yeah. Well, okay, so just to talk about that one first. Facebook is not the state. The First Amendment applies only against the state. And so Facebook is a private company. It can accept whatever ads it wishes and decline whatever ads it wishes. And so Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, has said, I don't want to be in the position in this world of saying what's true and what's false in a political ad, although I am in a position to say what's true and false in an ad that's about a political subject. So he made that distinction. And I don't know, that you make of that what you will. It seems to me whatever, but so that's the distinction that he made. And he said, so somebody tried to run a blatantly false political ad, and he said, no, you're not a candidate, it's not a political ad, therefore I'm pulling it because it's blatantly false. Then the person said, okay, I'm running for office, and therefore you can't tell me whether it's true or false. And Facebook said, no, you're not really running for office, you're just doing it to test our app. And once you get into those kind of conundrums, media policy begins to undo itself, and that's what's happening. The first part of your question was?
Superdelegates.
Oh, superdelegate. Well, this is a different question. This is about parties who say who gets to represent the party. And there's always a tendency, which is our progressive tendencies, to say one person, one vote, and transparency gives you the will of the people. Whether it does give you the will of the people, or whether because of that kind of transparency, you end up with a candidate that is, because of the bargaining among the factions in the party, that nobody wants, that's a complicated subject. And so the Democrats kept the superdelegates, although they've reduced them now for this time, in order to have an overall judgment that isn't bargained out among the whatever transparent factions there are in the party. We may be heading now for a situation in the Democratic Party where you're going to have a candidate that actually may not be, may be the result of bargaining among different constituencies in the Democratic Party, which may not represent overall the best interests of the party. That's a possible outcome. And the superdelegates are supposed to check that outcome. So the question of what's democratically responsive turns out to be a very complicated question, and not one of one person, one vote. That's an election, and we abide by an election. That's not often the best way to make a decision about what's representative, and you don't know because everyone isn't really voting in that way. Oh, I'm sorry.
Early in your remarks, you were going on about the importance of the Republican point of view and the importance of good
Smaller.
Small.
Yeah.
The importance of good representation.
Yes.
Whoever was thinking that way must be so upset now.
I know, it's a tough one, isn't it?
They must be very upset.
It is.
As we all.
I think everyone is upset.
That's right.
You don't have to be thinking that way to be upset.
Right.
You just have to be living
That's
that
right.
way.
Exactly.
Could you comment on the concept of this discourse of democracy and voting and gerrymandering?
Yeah.
And the fact that it seems to, in terms of the vote being a snapshot of the will of the people, certainly not.
Right. So one can say about gerrymandering is that it's inconsistent with the logic of representation, because there you do have a sense of what's distorted and what not. So if you have a state like Wisconsin where 57% of the people vote Democratic, but the legislature is 55% Republican, you have a problem. And that's true of our electoral college. It's true for a lot of institutions in the United States. And so just on the plain logic of representation, gerrymandering presents a problem. This court has said it's a political question. We won't deal with partisan gerrymandering, although they are able and willing to deal with racial gerrymandering. So they can do it, they just don't want to do it in the context of partisan misrepresentation. Interestingly enough, in the recent case in which they said they refused to deal with it, Elena Kagan filed a dissent, and the state court of North Carolina, which turns out to be Democratic, adopted her dissent as state constitutional law and set aside the electoral districts of North Carolina under that. So, these are complicated questions how what I would call the right answer filters out and around the different states, but there's room for hope on that, state by state.
Comment on rank order?
Rank order? I don't know enough. You really have to be an expert on voting systems to know much about that. I don't.
Corollary question, do you have any opinion on the National Popular Vote Compact?
Yeah. Well, this has to be approved by Congress, so good luck first.
It does?
I think so, because it's an interstate compact. Otherwise, it's not enforceable.
I voted, Connecticut passed it and I supported it. As I understood it, it had to be passed by the legislatures.
Right, but it's an interstate compact,
Yes.
which means if it's going to be binding and enforceable, it has to be approved by Congress. And so good luck with that.
By the Senate, Jim?
What?
By the Senate as well?
By Congress, yes.
They
So
didn't present it that way. As I recall, I don't remember that.
we can have an agreement, it's just a gentleman's agreement. So when you're dealing with your casting of the electoral
But I thought
votes.
it was cast in the sense of the Constitution appointing the state legislatures or the state governments to decide how they apportion their electors.
Right, so you have an election, and then the legislature decides to abide by the covenant or not.
Right, so why is
So
that?
let's say they don't decide, what are you gonna do? Let's say,
Well, then-
you're in the bargain, and let's say another state, let's say North Carolina, Florida's in the bargain, and it decides to break it, what do you do?
Well, then we're back, I mean, if they never get to the,
Yeah, but you've just wasted your votes.
that's where we are now.
Well, we might be, we may not be. The point about the convention compact is that it should be enforceable. It's an enforceable deal, as opposed to like a voluntary deal. And so that's where for it to be a constitutionally enforceable compact, it needs to be approved.
So it has to be uniform through all the states?
No, it's a compact, it's approved as a compact, but as a compact to be enforceable. Among all the, because you have an agreement among the different members, and you can always have defections.
Well,
If you have-
the minorities there, the states that don't pass the compact can still continue.
They can do whatever, but now you're in the compact.
You're in the compact.
And you're gonna throw all of we're not gonna come into force until we have a majority of the electoral
Exactly,
college.
right.
And then one state decides to defect that throws the majority the other way. What happens then?
Yeah, but if they don't, then it happens.
Well, then we're back to where we are.
Yeah, not quite, because all the rest of us have agreed to be bound by it. And so that means whatever you voted in those other states are not going to where you voted. So if those states abide by the compact and one defects, which goes the other way, and that can throw an election, this is a serious problem, I think. So it's a possibility, of course, if we can get it done. But, and this goes to an interesting point, which is you have an electoral college because parts of the country do feel like this is why we have the differences between large states and small states. The loyalties and the identifications are not to a population, they're to localities. And the problem is those localities, sometimes they're states, often they're regions, it's a complicated subject, how we defer. And the electoral college is a rough indicator of that. The Senate is a much more unevenly distributed indicator of that. And these are all problems in how one creates a system of representation where people feel an identity. And it may be we've reached the stage where we identify with whatever the majority of the population, it may not. But that's the underlying question that you're asking. Yeah.
Don't you think that even if Congress approved the National Voter Compact and one state decided to defect, that the Supreme Court would say that that's fine, the state has a right to decide how it apportions
it's a
its
concept.
electoral votes, and that's fine, that's okay.
It might. The court can do anything it wants, and then what are the rest of us going to do? But, that's the criteria for legality. So you have to pass that threshold if you're going to have a case at all.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much.
Thank you.